Hi, and thank you so much for joining the Conversations with Baldwin Salon this evening. My name is Heather Marks. I am the festival curator of Conversations with Baldwin. I am a mixed heritage Black woman wearing Black glasses with Black hair piled on top of my head with a white background. Words of Colour is producing the Conversations with Baldwin Festival, and we are a change agency that creates alternative pathways and sustainable opportunities for writers, creatives, entrepreneurs, and communities of colour to thrive, and for unheard stories to be told. Thank you so much for coming. I am really pleased to be welcoming you to the Salon tonight. The Conversations with Baldwin Salon is a digital series of panel discussions exploring the literature and the life of 20th century author, intellectual, and activist James Baldwin, and it forms part of the wider Conversations with Baldwin Festival program. The Conversations with Baldwin Festival is a hybrid festival that is celebrating James Baldwin's legacy and is supported using public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England. The festival takes place across London, Bristol, and virtually, and is curated in anticipation of 2024, which will commemorate the centenary of Baldwin's birth, and when we will return in even bigger, brighter, and better fashion. So, James Baldwin. He was an influential American writer, essayist, playwright, and social critic. He is renowned for his powerful and eloquent explorations of race, identity, sexuality, and social issues in 20th century America. Baldwin's works often provided profound insights into the complexities of the human experience. His literary output included novels, essays, plays, and poetry, and his writing was characterized by eloquent prose, sharp observations, and a deep commitment to exploring the human condition in all its dimensions. He confronted uncomfortable truths about America's history of racial oppression and challenged us to critically engage with these issues. So, the topic of tonight's Salon, Baldwin on friendship. Though James Baldwin was a great writer, he was not alone. His contemporaries included Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, Richard Wright, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., to name but a few. Friendship was hugely important to Baldwin. It offered him a place of retreat when the work got too heavy, and a place to practice the kind of radical love that he espoused in his literature. This Conversations with Baldwin Salon, titled Baldwin on Friendship, will explore the importance of friendship in Baldwin's growth as a writer, when he was called out with love and sometimes without, and the role of community in artistry and activism. I am so honored to be welcomed by Lisa Pegram, Nii Ayikwei Parkes, and Moses McKenzie. Sadly, Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias could no longer be here today, but rest assured that tonight's salon will be just as stimulating with our other esteemed guests, who I will now introduce. Lisa Pegram, who is chairing the discussion today, is an acclaimed writer, arts integration specialist, and publishing professional. Her endeavors as a literary publicist and acquisitions editor center around amplifying underrepresented voices and stories. Winner of the DC Mayor's Arts Award, Lisa has over 20 years of experience in high-level program design for such organizations as the Smithsonian Institute, Kennedy Center, Corcoran Gallery of Art, and National Geographic. She served as DC Writers Core Program Director for a decade, and as co-chair of United Nations affiliate international women's conferences in the US, India, and Bali. Her poetry book, Cracked Calabash, is archived at the W.B. Du Bois Library at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's currently based in St. Martin, where she serves on the annual book festival steering committee and is working on a food memoir that traces her family legacy from the Caribbean to the US and back again. Lisa, if you would like to give a description of yourself for our audience.
Yes, I am Lisa Pegram. I am a Black woman with long dreadlocks pulled to the side, wearing a turquoise top embroidered with lemons and green leaves and some textiles in the background.
Thank you, Lisa. Nii Ayikwei Parkes is a Ghanaian-British editor, curator, publisher, and writer. His debut, Tale of the Bluebird, was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Prize and went on to win France's Prix Baudelaire, Prix Laure Bataillon, and was named Best First Foreign Book of the Year by Lear. Described as a poet of ritualistic delicacy, He is the author of The Makings of You and the Geese, the latter shortlisted for the Walcott Prize, selected as a Poetry Book Society 2020 recommendation, and recently translated to Swedish. Named as one of Africa's 39 most promising writers of the new generation by the Hay Foundation, Nii Ayikwei's recent novel, Azupar, has been described as beautiful and moving, a new kind of Caribbean novel with a reach beyond the region. His non-fiction work explores music, nature, race, writing, and the proto-colonialism survivals of African philosophy, skills and ways of being in Africa, and the African diaspora. He serves on the boards of World Literature Today and the Kane Prize, and is a non-resident fellow of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Nii, if you'd love to describe yourself for us.
Hi, I'm Nii Ayikwei Parkes. I am a Black man with shoulder-length dreadlocks, with dyed blonde at the ends, wearing a black cardigan and a very cool necklace.
Thank you very much, Nii. And now I'll introduce our final panelist, Moses McKenzie. Moses McKenzie wrote his debut, An Olive Grove and Ends, at the age of 21. The novel was listed as a Guardian Novel of the Year 2022 and shortlisted for the Writers Guild Best First Novel Award in 2023. He was named as one of the Observer's 10 must-read debut novelists of 2022 and won Soho House Breakthrough Writer Award in the same year. He is also the recipient of the 2023 Hawthornden Prize for Imaginative Prose. He is currently working on the TV adaptation of An Olive Grove and Ends and has recently completed his second novel, Fast by the Horns, which will be published in spring 2024. Welcome, Moses, if you'd like to describe yourself for us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm a Black man with a white background, the plainest background here. Yeah, I'm wearing a fleece, black fleece. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Moses. Thank you. Welcome to my esteemed panel and chair. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I will now hand over to Lisa, who will chair this evening's salon. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am so excited to sit with you and these esteemed panelists to discuss one of my favorite writers and one who is influential to many of us, James Baldwin. And I would love to start out by saying that I hope the general vibe of this conversation would be something like the interviews and conversations that you get to see with Baldwin when he is talking to his friends. And Heather had described this salon as sort of a breaking of bread. There's a certain intimacy in those kind of conversations that's different when you see Baldwin speaking with in a debate or in a more formal academic situation. So I am hoping that we will be able to bring some of the warmth that we have been able to witness in Baldwin's conversations with his friends to this conversation today. In an interview with Cambridge.org, Baldwin's friendships with others were characterized by a deep generosity of spirit. He often lent his time, money, and boundless energy to the creative and vocational pursuits of his closest friends, and was rewarded with similar demonstrations of generosity in return. For Baldwin, friendship was not simply an amicable and reciprocal bond of identification between admirers. If you were a friend of Jimmy's, you were kin. And Baldwin has been known to say that his friends are not his siblings, but his brothers. And I always find the differentiation between colleagues and friends for James Baldwin is those who call him Jimmy. So I am going to dedicate this conversation to those who called him Jimmy. So we will start with the chosen family. And I would like to ask our panelists, just also so we can have a little background for the audience as well, what is your understanding of the chosen family of fellow artists that James Baldwin collected over the course of his life? And is there any relationship that you find particularly compelling?
It's easier for me to answer the second question first. I think the relationship that I find most compelling is probably his relationship with, from what I know of it, which is, I think, the biggest thing to say first. But from the outside looking in, I think his relationship with Toni Morrison is probably the most interesting. But that's probably because I just have those two's work on a pedestal. So it's interesting to me how they would have propelled each other's work. and the conversations they would have had that wouldn't have been known to us. I think that's what interests me in that. And then in regard to the chosen family, I think it's probably like the like-mindedness that they were attracted to. I think in this well, in all industries, but in this industry, especially if you're writing, well, novel writing or poetry, it can be quite lonely, which I like, but I can imagine some people wouldn't, or some people may struggle with. So when you do find people who not only work or practice the same craft, but practice the same craft with similar intentions and similar worldviews and so on, I think that could be quite comforting to a lot of artists.
Wonderful. Nii?
Yeah, I think the idea of comfort, which Moses ended with, is probably where it starts for me. I have a theory that one of the reasons why Black people like church so much in the West is because it's the thing that comes closest to duplicating the kind of community philosophy that they came from. So in a way, in the New World, church is where they would go to because you could have community. And for some reason, I don't think James Baldwin ever stopped being a preacher. So in a way, he was always gathering a congregation. And in this way, he was a community leader of this congregation of friends. And I think that's also why his friendships are so varied, and of so many kind of different strata in terms of like age, accomplishment, and the fact that he gave them all attention in the same way is really, really interesting to me. So I think actually his chosen family is really his congregation. It's just that he had walked away from the church. That's just my conception of it. In terms of the friendships, I mean, I think Beaufort Delaney is interesting, just in the sense that, him having come from the South and being in Harlem and giving James a kind of template of how he could be in the world as a queer man. But I think the one I find more compelling is Amiri Baraka, because Amiri Baraka criticized Baldwin in the way that Baldwin criticized Wright, and yet Baldwin held him close in spite of that. And it's really interesting for me also in terms of the social environment of America, the social structure of America, and the social reality of America, which we're still witnessing now, that he's almost between these two generations of men who didn't believe that America could be reconciled on race, Wright and Baraka. And I think the tragedy of James Baldwin, and also the beauty of his spirit, is that he always believed that something could be redeemed. And that's one of the things I find most compelling about him, which is why I gift his books to people, because I think that eternal hope is something that drives us somewhere keeps driving us to reach for something better, even if we can't quite get there.
I just find that really compelling. And your observation of your comparison between Amiri Baraka's relationship with Baldwin and Baldwin's relationship with Wright, which, for those who don't know, Richard Wright was he called him his literary father, and he was really influential in his life. And then he had an opportunity to write a critique of Native Son, which was Wright's seminal work. And when he did, he wrote this scathing review, and their relationship kind of did not recover from that. And Baldwin regretted it later. So I think there's also something interesting to be said about his ability to then rise above that in his relationship with Baraka, right? To say, if this young man is going to criticize me, perhaps I'm going to extend him a level of grace because I've been in that position. But the other thing that you said that I found compelling was the fact that Blackness is not a monolith. So we do have this generational tug, push, and pull about how to best show up as our activist selves in representation of Black people as intellectuals. And so there are going to be differences in opinion, and there are going to be differences in strategies, and that should not and those differences and the friendship and the love should not be mutually exclusive. So I really found that interesting what you said, because it really speaks to the fact that we should be able to differ in opinion, and we should be able to have different positions, obviously, because we're not all the same, and still be able to express that love.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I think there's something, if you look at the full trajectory of those relationships, to be said about age as well, because Baraka, when he was older, also regretted criticizing Baldwin.
All right. Any more thoughts on The Chosen Family before we move on?
No, I mean, I was just saying that it's funny because one of the ways in which I kind of reward my chosen family in literature is I give them Baldwin books. So, you know, when people are coming up, I say, sometimes if I can't explain something, I say, just read this. And then, you know, they'll make their own journey and come back and have a conversation later.
Which books do you give most often?
Most often, Giovanni's Room. Most often. Fire Next Time as well, but Giovanni's Room most often, because I find it's the book that explores people's conceptions quickest. People's preconceptions quickest. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to just bridge from that to ask, what role has, you've already started this, but what role has Chosen Family played in your own life as a writer?
So my books come out, or when my book came out in, when did it come out? 2022. When it came out last year, that was my first way into the industry. So I wasn't doing journalist work before, or I didn't enter into any competitions or anything like that. So I had no writers community coming in. And then since being in, I think I've kind of, in a way, actively tried not to get into any sort of community. But then also, the few people who I have made connections with, it's just more, yeah, I guess we haven't prioritized linking up consistently and speaking about the work consistently. I think, like I said, or I alluded to earlier, I think I actually kind of like the solitude of the writing. And then I don't know in terms of both of your own writing, but I'm not a great fan of reading other contemporary fiction while I'm working on my fiction, if you see what I'm saying. Which I used to hear musicians say, or it was mainly rappers I used to hear say the same thing, like, oh, I don't listen to other rappers. And I never understood it as a consumer, as a fan, or as a child as well. But then subsequently to being or becoming a writer, I think I actually do understand it. So it's difficult for me to answer. I can theorize and I can see.
Do you?
Yeah, go to you.
If I may, do you have a family of creatives that's not in the writing game?
This is the thing, and that's why I said, oh, what are we distinguishing? Because I have a support system. If you know what I'm saying, my pops is a photographer. I've been a photographer.
Right.
One of my brothers is an actor. So yeah, so I have that, and if I have or require those conversations, and conversation is so massively important. But then also as writers, we just know the importance of books and the conversations that you can have with yourself, but with books.
Yeah.
So many of the people I read, like Baldwin and his contemporaries and people before him, after him, they're the conversations I'm engaging with. What they're talking about, if you see what I'm saying, and they're in a way, their work and what they contribute is my support system in a similar way to how my family is. So yeah.
I think that's an important distinction, and I think it is important to note that Baldwin's chosen family of creatives were interdisciplinary, right? So they were not all writers. They're photographers. You've got Miles Davis, you've got Buford Delaney, who was a visual artist. So that notion, and I also kind of, I think I'm working with this theory of the notion that Black art is in its nature interdisciplinary. So I would think that all the different art forms kind of inform each other. So I'm not surprised to hear you say that while you maybe don't have authors or other writers that were in your circle, artists of other disciplines might find their way.
Yeah, and it's interesting to speak. Oh, I find it in a way more interesting to speak to people who practice different disciplines, because what almost every single art is concerned with storytelling in some way or another. Well, I think you could summarize it wholly as that. But they're obviously prioritizing and approaching it in slightly different ways, ways in which that you could actually take from and then put into your writing, and it could actually be something not new, because I think newness is impossible, but something that feels new at least.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because often when people ask me who I aspire to write like, I actually say that my kind of idol in terms of creativity is more John Coltrane than a writer per se, right? And it's an approach to storytelling. All forms of art are storytelling. But having said that, I do have writing contemporaries that, you know, I kind of came up with, because I started out in poetry, which is a very you need to go out and read. Yeah, and so you meet people and you share struggles, and so you form these bonds. And so I do have writer friends, and I read them. Sometimes I don't. But also, you know, I have academic friends who are academics. One of the first people I send my work to is a social scientist based in Ghana, Nii Ayikwei. And we have these wonderful discussions. So I value my writer friends for conversation, not really to talk about craft per se, but just also because they tend to be really interesting, multifaceted people. As I'm sure you are, Moses, because, you know, if you are as a photographer, you're going to see light in a particular with a particular nuance that other people who don't, you know, commune with a photographer don't have, you know, and that kind of, everybody's got little shades which they kind of bring to the party, and for me that's the value of that family.
I agree. And sorry to go, you're right to even mention that, because I forgot, but one of my good friends is a historian, and he's graduating from Oxford this year, and his conversation is very valuable to me, very valuable, in the same way that your friend in Ghana, and it's that academic, because I don't know if you're similar, but a lot of what I read as well, I think it's about 50-50 in terms of what I read is non-fiction. And so many of my own ideas for fiction come from non-fiction as opposed to coming from fiction. So having those, his conversation is in a way like some of the most valuable in the selfish, like, what am I taking from the conversation way? Because what he's reading is similar to what I'm reading, but then it goes beyond that as well, because his concern is almost wholly non-fiction. So I hear what you're saying fully.
I think there was also definitely that impact on Baldwin and within that circle of friends. And I was really intrigued by his relationships with both Miles Davis, which apparently was a very special relationship. Apparently they were both kind of artistically shy and guarded and mercurial folks, you know, outside of being public figures. And so that they were able to recognize that in each other and really open up when they were just the two of them together. And apparently Davis spent a lot of time at Baldwin's home in France, and they would just sit in the house and talk for hours and drink wine and eat food, and then go out in the garden and sit and talk and drink wine and eat food. And they would just do that over and over again. And Baldwin would talk about the storytelling, which is exactly what you were just saying, that the way that Davis approached storytelling had a huge impact on then how he translated that in, you know, in a literary sense. The other person that I thought was interesting was Marlon Brando, which I was not aware that Baldwin had a friendship with. I just want to read this. There was an interview of Marlon Brando, and they asked him what he cared most about. And he said, if you asked me to state what was important or lasting, it would have to be that I walked and sat and dreamed next to a man named James Baldwin. James, or Jimmy, knew how to analyze, place, describe, repair, and destroy things, all in the right way and for the right reasons. Baldwin, as I like to call him, taught me to think in a piercing way about things far more important than scripts or contracts or poems. He taught me to look into and understand people and their motives and their identities. And I didn't always like what I saw, but it led me towards something that might be called freedom.
Yeah.
Right. So
I think their relationship makes a lot of sense as well. If you think that Brando, especially at the time, I know there were others, but has come to embody like so much of Stanislavski's theory into practice, and the rawness and the realness of that is very much reflected in Baldwin's work.
Mhm.
And then, sorry, I thought this earlier and I forgot to say, but speaking about Coltrane, that's I think I've had the same experience with listening to Coltrane with the opening chords of Giant Steps. If you think it's like dun, 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 that starts like very abrupt and immediately, it's like almost like, what's it called? Beginning a story in media res, in the middle of things. Like
Yes.
in 100 Years of Solitude, you begin, or you get right into, I can't remember the character's name, but is in the firing line. Or it's
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
intersection of ice, and the
Yeah.
character's
Right
in the
in the
firing
moment.
line,
Yes.
straight away, yeah. And you can draw comparisons between the two in the same way you can draw comparisons between the two with Brando and Baldwin and their approach to art. So I think that, like, yeah, it's comfort. I think it comes back to the comfort and the community and congregation.
Mhm. Mhm. Indeed, those are connected, and that because you have folks from all of these different disciplines, they can inform each other in interesting and exciting ways, and not just also in the work, but just what you find interesting as a person. Like you said, the kind of community, the people you want to hang out with, have conversations with,
Yeah.
and sit with, yeah,
And drink with.
and drink with. Because that's what artists you want to sit, drink, and break bread with. Those are the people you want to. I want to see the conversations where, especially like where Baldwin, you would see him, he would like sit back in his chair and cross his leg, and there would be like a cigarette, and then you know that it was either a drink or a cup of coffee, and you knew some kind of good conversation. Those people, that is the kind of conversation that that we're talking about. Thank you. Okay, so I want to now shift to the notion of the mentor-mentee kind of friendship, because these are friendships. It's not just a power dynamic, right? But there are friendships between people, sometimes because of age and sometimes because of where they're in their career. For example, you know, you mentioned Morrison earlier, and Morrison and Baldwin may have been closer in age than some of the younger people that he was friends with, but because Morrison started putting her work out later, she was not a literate, she was younger than him in the literary sense, right? So she was a generation behind him in the literary sense. And so Baldwin really did, you know, serve as both mentor and mentee. He was nurtured by artists. We talked about Buford Delaney, Richard Wright. And when his star rose, he paid it forward. You know, he took folks like Toni Morrison and Lorraine Hansberry, and by extension, Nina Simone and Maya Angelou under his wing. And he often leveraged their personal relationships to challenge them outside of their comfort zones. So when Maya Angelou wrote I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, that happened at a party. The concept for that book happened at a party that she was at with Baldwin, and he wanted her to write this memoir, and she was refusing because she said, I'm a poet. And it was at a party with a bunch of literary people, and they were like, we've got to get her to write this memoir. How do we do it? He said, the way to get Maya to do something is to tell her that she can't do it. That's the way to do it. So they start having this conversation at the dinner about how, oh, it's too bad that you wouldn't be able to do this because you don't write prose. You know, they really just kind of circled around her in a way that pushed her, you know, to write that book. So he took the personal trust and used that to push them to higher levels in their career. So I'm curious about that mentor-mentee role in friendships and what you find unique about how that manifests between Black creatives, taking somebody under your wing and sort of pushing them forward.
I mean, I work as an editor, so some of that kind of comes with the territory. It has been valuable for me to have a couple of people who, when I was starting out, I started in the corporate world, and I kind of was writing in Ghana, and I just walked into the office of a poet called Atukwe Okai, and showed him some of my work. And I was asking him, you know, I just asked him to read. He never met me before, but he took the work. I went away. He said, come back in a couple of weeks. I came back, and he says, okay, so this is decent. I said, so, you know, should I quit my job? He says, I can't tell you to quit your job, but I will tell you that you've got very good work here. And that kind of gave me the courage to throw my hat in. And so, you know, that was poetry. And then I think later on, getting pushed into prose, speaking about Maya Angelou being pushed into prose, I have a friend called Courtney Newland, who when I met was writing plays, and he had a couple of novels out, and he had a residency at a place in West London called the Post Office Theatre, which is now closed. But on the weekends, he would just open the door. Speaking of gathering, you know, creative folks, he would just Black creatives of all sorts, rappers, musicians, photographers would all come and sit in there on the weekend and just talk. And then at some point he'd open the space for people to share anything they wanted to share, you know. So often we'd share poems, or somebody would have like a rhyme they were working on, spit something, you know, somebody might play along. It was just a really beautiful space. And one day he said to me, "Oh, why don't you try a short story and come and share it next time?" And I did. And while the audience response was good, later on, he gave me the sheet of paper and it had so many red marks on it. And I hate being bad at stuff. So I went away and I worked on my prose. And then, you know, I ended up touring around the UK with him doing short stories, but that's how I got into prose. So it's been important for me. And I now edit prose and poetry. So yeah, I would say it's been an important part of my journey.
How about you, Moses?
I wouldn't say it's been an important part. I think maybe because I think when I was in I started working in Sainsbury's when I was 15. That was my first job, and I knew it from before, but it just solidified how much I struggled with being told to do something. And as I went on in the working world, that's something that continued. And I think that's, and then see as well, seeing my pops being a photographer and working for himself, I kind of knew that's the only thing that I could have done. So whether that was, I don't know, in a trade or whatever, that's the route I would have ended up in, regardless. So it's not something I've ever sought out, and I think I can see how beneficial it was or could be, depending on who that person is in your life as in a mentor. But I also think it's very, and I know Nii will agree with this, I think it's very valuable to make mistakes by yourself, and to put stuff out and be wrong and be vulnerable with your work, but also be kind of arrogant and brazen with your work, because it's all a learning curve. And I would just, I think it's more done, I don't know if it's personality or what, or ego even perhaps, but I don't know how much I'd benefit or would allow myself to benefit from that sort of advice. I'd much rather be wrong and strong, I think, as the type of person I am. But that being said, again, I kind of allude to it again. I think the work that I hold up in such high esteem, the artists like Baldwin, who I hold up in such high esteem, I kind of learn my lessons from their work, if you see what I'm saying. And I'm constantly, I don't agree that comparison is the thief of joy in this sense, because I'm constantly holding my work next to theirs, knowing that I'm falling short and trying to see where I'm falling short. So it's like, and Baldwin, Angelou, Morrison, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, more recently Vasily Grossman, there's people who I look at as writing flawless, not necessarily all of their works, but that's more subjective, but flawless pieces of work, and then I try and hold myself to that standard. So I'd say their work mentors me, or mentors the craft, as opposed to like
I mean,
an individual. But yeah, sorry, what were you gonna say?
I can see where you're coming from, but it also depends on how you conceive of the mentorship relationship.
For sure.
Because if Courtiers says to me something's not working, he can't tell me how to fix it. What it does is questions me, and I have to think of, how do I solve this problem? And that's part of the growth. And the all the works you mentioned, I agree with you. I would not call them flawless. I'd call them courageous, and that's what I seek to do, right, in my work. So I think ultimately the mentorship relationship is, there are even young people that I edit, but there are moments of mentorship in the other direction while I'm editing them, because I see, sometimes I'm looking at somebody's work and I think, oh my God, that is so courageous. You need to be pushing harder because of somebody's fearlessness in the way they're approaching something. They may not have got there, but I can admire the ambition. And that ambition pushes me to continually be ambitious, because you do get to a point when you're a creative where you will produce decent work. And sometimes you can fall into comfort because that decent work will be praised. The spur to keep being courageous and to keep pushing sometimes, actually often, has to come from the outside world. And some of that is through, some of that outside world is the reading, right? You encounter new books, or sometimes you reread a book that you thought you knew, and you find new things because you have become more enlightened. So I think, it's really about how you conceive of what it means to have a mentor, because if you think of it as a corrector, then you can't have that relationship.
And that's exactly, I completely agree. And I think it's partly with, and this is just to go into me talking about myself, but I think it's more about, like you said, my conception not only of the role, but of the word. I think I have a problem with the word mentor and what a mentor should be. And I think it's quite I think the word has a lot of weight, and or it should has a lot of weight and quite a lot of power that I don't like. So I think, do you see what I'm saying? And I don't.
So is it the word?
Partly, because I know that I fixate on words, and then I make broad brush statements, just that's how I like to communicate. But so it's, and I totally hear what you're saying. I think I was always encouraged to have, in terms of my family, my support system, a very internal locus of control. You know what I'm saying? So when I look at something that I've done, I do think I can be quite balanced. Yeah. And no one obviously knows your intention better than yourself. Yeah. Well, depending on how you create. But if you create work intentionally in a considered way, as opposed to I don't know, like musicians who are just on drugs, some musicians who just go on drugs, and whatever comes out. That's a completely different process. But if you aim to create work in an intentional, considered manner, I think your own opinion is obviously the most important. You know what I'm saying? Because if your brethren now has said about your short stories, for example, well, it also does depend where you are in the process, because obviously that was your first time writing short stories or first time sharing short stories. And so in that position, as someone who's written a lot, as someone who's written none, that advice is valuable then. But if he turned around and said, "Oh, I don't think da da da," and you put a red line through like your favorite line, you have to go with what you believe.
Of course.
Yeah.
But so this is the thing. You're very right about the weight of words and the way that mentor can carry this weight. But I think the relationship is greater than the word. So I mean, for me, English is not my only language, so I don't fixate on the meanings as much. But I completely understand, because I think really, whenever somebody puts a red line through something I'm doing, I'm going to say, this is what I was trying to do. I'm not just going to be quiet, right? And in the same way, when you have a community of friends, 3 people read the same thing and they'll read them different ways. So you're very right. Intent is so important. But with your intent, there's also a level of success in achieving that intent, because language is abstract. We're only ever reaching, right? We're reaching, we're not quite there. And so whatever can push me to get closer to that, whatever question can get me closer to that is important. So, obviously that relationship is sometimes with an editor, Sometimes it's with an agent. So for instance, my agent knows me, and we have this understanding that my books always take a long time to sell because I'm not writing stuff that is easily categorized, but I know exactly what I'm doing every time I write. And my agent understands that. And I've stayed with him for close to 20 years because we have that relationship. And he understands that you don't tell me to write something like somebody is writing because it will sell better.
Fair.
You ask me what I'm trying to do and I'll explain it.
Fair.
We'll talk from there. So, you know, yeah, I think mentor definitely has that, you know, weight.
And I think
Yeah,
it was,
I
I think
completely
the
agree.
thing about Baldwin that's interesting too is that there is this play over the course of his life of him being in both positions, right? So assuming both positions and benefiting not only from the feedback, because we're focusing right now on critique, but sometimes the mentorship is just seeing someone who's at a different point in the road that you, and seeing how they occupy the space. So Baldwin moved to France because of his experiences visiting Wright in France, right? When Baldwin was a young writer and he was rolling around with Delaney in Greenwich Village, he didn't know anything about how to move as an artistic Black man in that era in the world. How do you even step into those shoes? This is a man who shows him how that works and how it's possible. So it's not just an editor or a red pen, but a person. I almost think of it again as like in a big sibling kind of dynamic level of intimacy there that supersedes the page.
It's almost like that distinction between a friend that challenges you and a friend that just hypes you.
Right.
And I think of, when you're speaking that, I think of that conversation he had with Nikki Giovanni, right? And you know,
fabulous conversation.
That you can see that he's being pushed in that conversation. He's the older writer, but Nikki is not stepping back. She's saying what she wants to say. He has to consider it. And I think for me, that conversation is a moment of mentorship, both ways.
Both ways. Yeah, that's an excellent example. Okay, let's move on to the next question, because I could talk about this mentorship forever. We want to get to the other questions.
Sorry, I'll just say something quickly.
Go ahead, Moses. Yeah, please.
For me, I think, because I agree with everything you said, I completely agree with. But I do have to fixate on language, and perhaps it is because of, well, this excluding patois, English is obviously my primary language. So it's through English is how I understand the world, and I would just simply put it as community, as opposed to like mentorship. Because like you said, when you say, "Oh, this is my mentor," that the power dynamics are established, and it won't necessarily be considered that it's a two-way road, as it always will be, or as it always should be, I should say. Whereas in the word community, I think it's taken away. And as in the power dynamics are taken away, and it's actually a more honest word, I think. To represent that relationship.
I'm taking on that one. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so now we're going to level the playing field a bit, and I want to talk a bit about old friends. Okay, so these are people that you come up with. These are not people that are ahead of you on the road. These are people who were with you on the road every step of the way. And Baldwin had two old friends, Richard Avedon and Saul Stein, who went to the same school that he went to. While when he was a boy, they went to the same grade school. I believe it was a predominantly white school though. So they were two of his first white friends, very different experience from where he was living in New York at the time. And they became very close and would engage in ongoing debate about a lot of things, including race, over the course of their lives, from the time they were children till they were adults. They all became creatives in one sense or the other. Avedon was a photographer, and then collaborated as adults and continued that debate and conversation in a way that possibly, particularly because of the racial dynamics, would not have been able to happen had they not had the foundation of their childhood friendship. So not everyone can grow along with you over the course of your life, right? There are some people who you leave in childhood or you leave in adolescence, but there are others who carry over the course of your life. And particularly if you become a public figure like Baldwin, who is exposed to so many people, their perceptions of who you are, and their motivations behind engaging with you, an old friendship has a different level of stability. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about the value of those kind of connections. So not the people that you learned when you came into maybe those people are artists, but not the people that you came into knowing through the artistic space, but your old friends. What is the value of those friendships to someone of Baldwin's stature?
I mean, I think the value is in the situation, right? Because they know him before he became a public figure. So it's almost like what you can look back on. The number of things that somebody who knows you that long can question you on is a longer list than somebody who's only known you as an artist. There are also people who've seen you in transition, who've seen you deal with different challenges in different ways, and sometimes might be there to remind you that you can actually overcome certain obstacles when you're in despair. I mean, in Baldwin's particular case with those friends, I think that those friendships endured partly because of Baldwin's generosity, and his deep faith in America, because I don't know that they would have endured otherwise if they had to make the effort. But that's just me.
Okay, that's your theory.
Yeah,
I agree. And to build off the back of that, I think they, like you said, is you have your intention, and then your intention can be successful or not as successful as you would have liked. And those old friends, I think, are best placed to know your intention and to know what your intention is, and then to hold you accountable in that. And yeah, I think whether they're artists or not, so long as they engage in your work and in you, or not even necessarily your work, but in you, and I think they can do that both consciously and unconsciously.
yeah.
Thank
And
you.
I think with Baldwin, I would also say, I would count his younger brother as one of those friends. David. Yeah.
It's David that The Fire Next Time is dedicated to. Yes, the letter is to David. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that also helps, because it's kind of like it keeps it balanced, because he's family and friend. And I think actually he's responsible for the greater connection with Amiri Baraka later on, because Amiri was friends with David. But yeah. But yeah, I think those old friends are important, and that's why you can come up not really having friends within your discipline, and still, have a drive and have belief in what you're doing, because friends are invested in you, are interested in what you're doing, and you can speak to them about what you're trying to do, because sometimes just in conversations we articulate, better our intentions to others than we do to ourselves, and they become solidified. And so I think those old friendships are important. I have several, and
yeah, I completely agree. And that's they also, a lot of them are coming from the same place, so they have quite similar frames of reference. So what your work is concerned with is often their reality and what they're concerned with, but in a different way, in a more practical way. So yeah.
Yes, they have the same subjective lens that you do, or a similar one.
Similar, yeah.
Yeah, so a way that you can trust their feedback is different.
And when I say feedback, I don't even mean necessarily showing them.
I don't mean critique.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying critique. I'm saying, when I said consciously or unconsciously, I mean a lot of my brethren, a lot of the friends that I'm coming from don't read at all. Let alone my work, they don't read regardless. So I'm saying, even just in conversations that I have with them, and I'm not leading the conversation, but they'll end up in talking about things that I'm trying to talk about in my work.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You see what I'm saying? That's
So
what
that
I mean.
reinforces that your kind of intent is in the right
In the right place, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
not some imaginary thing that you're dealing with. It's
some
still
far
kind
off
of connected
academic
with the
thing.
world.
Yeah, it's real life.
Yeah.
And it's
And I
rooted
would
in real
imagine
people.
that there are a whole cadre of friends like that Baldwin have. We just don't know their names.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, 100%.
I mean, you can see it in his work, what he's concerned with, who he finds important. You know, we know the big splashy names, but I'm sure there are lots of people, like you just said, even friends who maybe don't even read books, right? That were able to give him a level of connection to his work and a level of insight that was just as valuable as anyone who was a celebrity.
Yeah. He wouldn't have been able to have written anything that he wrote without growing up where he did, and with the people that he grew next to. And it's completely obvious that he never, well, I can't say never, I can't speak definitively for him, but anything that I've read of his has never lost focus of that. And
Right.
it's never lost that respect and love and belief in redemption that he's talking about in people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Indeed. Thank you. All right. So when friend becomes foe, so I want to come back to this, well, these power dynamics, this mentorship idea, but also the conversation that we had earlier about Wright and Baldwin and this moment where he wrote the scathing review. And there was sort of a rupture in the relationship. So, you know, friends are often like family, and that's not always a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
So my first part of that question is it necessary to kill your heroes to rise to their level? Because it was basically a generational shift that was happening, right? So you were establishing yourself as the new guard, which when that is in direct conflict with what the old guard was doing might rub up against your relationship. So is it necessary to distinguish yourself in that way? And then how does one call out and heal those transgressions should they occur?
I don't think it's necessary to do it publicly. I think if I think the friendship should always come first. And this is going away slightly from writing, but I think the friendship should always come first. So if I had a friend, and not like a writing friend, but an actual someone I considered a friend, whether they write or not, and I thought they wrote something that was where the intention wasn't successful, let's say, I would speak to them in private. I wouldn't write, and especially knowing that no matter who I believe my audience is, the majority of my readers are white.
That's right.
So
there's different implications behind it.
Exactly. So when I then publicize my criticism of my friend who is also black, who is also an artist, I have to think, yeah, cool. Even if, again, I can't put myself in the shoes, but even if I think I'm doing my friend right, I have to consider who's going to be consuming my work and how they're going to be consuming my work. And he does talk about an artistic responsibility. So yeah, I don't think publicly is the right thing to do. Where I've read in his notes of a native son, the more notes of a native son, the second one, when he criticizes VS Naples, I think that's different. They weren't friends, one, and two, I think there's a lot of room to criticize Naples. But you know what I'm saying? But yeah, so I would say I can understand why he regretted that, and I think he was probably right to regret that.
I think that's a very powerful point that you made about you can do it. That doesn't mean you have to do it publicly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a huge difference.
I agree with Moses. I think the milieu of the time probably influenced that, you know. There's a way in which the public domain of America, in terms of artists who were black, and we still see it happening to some degree now, is like there's space for one.
That's right.
So it creates this thing where even if the moment you're not fully engaged and not thinking about the implications, you can fall into that trap. And you know, this is why we talk about Black artists having a burden of responsibility, even if they don't want it.
Yeah.
Because you can't just be somebody who's responding to something, because you then have to think about how society is going to spin that. And I completely agree. I would have done it in private. I mean, I have done so to, you know, people I know who have come up before me in private, about their work and stuff like that. And, you know, and if I'm asked to review something of a friend's and I don't think it is something that I admire, I will refuse to review it, you know, and that kind of thing, because I think it's important. Yes, it's important for them to grow, but I shouldn't be the one knocking them in public. I mean, the thing about Baldwin is the moment he accepted to review it, he was always going to be James, in the sense that he'll always be true to himself. He never just looked at things as how they are, but how they should be, or how he felt they should be. And so you can't ask him to kind of respond to something where he thinks it's falling short and not speak about how it's falling short. So the only remedy in that situation would have been for him not to do the job. But then we go again to the milieu at the time and how many ways they had to make money. And then you're going to be caught in this situation where maybe that was his bread for the next month. And they're like, review this. And so then James is, you know, again, I go back to church. There's something so honest about him that makes him a very compelling figure. On one level, beautiful, triumphant, energetic. On another level, almost tragic, because he cannot lie to save his life. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, so I just think he's just a really compelling figure to me. In the way that I find Prince, the artist, also compelling, because again, he's torn between his values and his impulses all the time. And tension, you know, Walcott writes in one of his essays that tension creates memory. And I think that's why they're so memorable. It is that kind of eternal conflict of, absolutely, James Baldwin always wanted to do the best by his friends. I feel, but he would also absolutely never lie about what he felt about something. So it's kind of like, yeah. You won.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to shift now to, we talked about also the implications, and I love that point that you made about the implications of being a creative in industries that often Black folks are disenfranchised in. You don't have too many opportunities. There's only but so many seats at the table. And so when you have the opportunity to open the door, hold the door open for someone else, that carries a lot more weight when you are a Black artist. And that also, I find, is true in terms of gender. So even still, right, you have certainly more men being published than women, and or accessing opportunities in a different kind of way in the creative art space, not to mention in that time period that Baldwin was functioning in. Baldwin made a really concerted effort to create relationships with and support and promote Black women artists. Lorraine Hansberry, Maya Angelou, Nina Simone, so many women, Nikki Giovanni, and actively not only being friends with them, but also supporting their careers with the status that he had achieved as a male artist, which I found really compelling. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are about Baldwin being an intentional, active ally to Black women in his inner circle.
I had a talk a while ago with an author who, one of his central characters was a woman, well, quite naturally. And I remember asking him how he was a man, how he approached writing women in general. And he said that he wrote her, he struggled with it a lot, he said, and then he just decided just to write her and ignore the fact that she was a woman. Which, and then for the rest of the talk, we kind of like argued because of that, because that's what he said. But yeah, I think, especially as a man, the responsibility that I feel when writing women is probably I feel most responsible when I'm writing women, especially women in my age range, because I think to me they're the characters, or that's the reality. But in my work, they're the characters who I actually struggle to see most naturally. The women my age come to me most, like, they're the most difficult to write. And it's not about me, so I won't get into why. But because of that, I think it's very important to listen to women, to read women's work, and to know that you can listen as much as you want. You can try and explore it and their reality as much as you want. But there is going to be a level that you don't understand. But as long as you have the consideration, and you acknowledge the duty of care that you have, and then only after that can you write with, because you do need to write with fearlessness in order to write a compelling story. But I'd say it is crucial to have genuine friendships with both men and women in order to write, in order to know, just in order to write. So I think it's the reason I think it's good is because it's just so necessary, and to do otherwise, I think you'd be left with works that actually no, I was about to diss other people's work, but I think you'd be left with subpar work where women are characterized in a very narrow way.
Yeah. Thank you. Nii?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the fact that we are noticing and talking about it is more a commentary on the failure of other men and necessarily about Baldwin's uniqueness. I mean, we go back to the church, that's his congregation is all people, and he wants to make space for all people. And the fact that women in the industry were and still are treated differently by a lot of men is more a failure on the part of those men than something to be hailed. When it's done, because it should be the norm. And so I admire him for doing it, but I don't necessarily think it's something
to praise.
I don't think it's something that we should be aspiring to continue hailing. I don't know how that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
it does make sense though.
Yeah,
it does.
I just think that, and I don't want to get into politics, but capitalist society is very transactional and doesn't promote empathy because of that. Because if you're empathetic and like if you're telling a boy of 18 and a boy of 18 and a man of 18 and a woman of 18 to go out in the night, they have very different concerns about getting from A to B. And if you can't center that in the way that you make space for people, it just means you have a lack of empathy.
Yeah.
Full stop. Because you don't treat a child the same way you treat a grandparent. So you must take into account everybody's space and the space they take up, or the experience, whatever. Everyone's condition must be taken into account. And if you do that, then you will always create space. But I just think, he was doing the right thing, but
Whenever I moderate discussions, I always like to end on the note of joy. I think it's super important, particularly when we're talking about Black art, Black activism, because there is so much focus on the struggle, right? And nobody needs to be walking around with all that cortisol coursing through their veins all the time. We have to activate our joy. And one of my favorite photos of Baldwin, he's at a house party, and he's at a house party and he's dancing with Lorraine Hansberry. You could tell it's somebody's apartment. They're just in the living room. They've had a few drinks and they're They are mid groove. His arms are mid eagle. They're just having a great time. And so I just want to ask you all about how you experience that joyful side of Baldwin's life, in addition to all of his intellectual successes, how you experience that in your understanding of Baldwin's life and your own as part of the creative process or being an artist.
I feel joy in the writing. I feel like when Baldwin was putting words together, those sentences, yes, they might be cutting, but to put them together, you have to experience something close to joy in like putting that line together. You know, for me, when I'm writing, I experience joy. I feel like I'm reaching for something, and it's almost ethereal. It's like that's my church, and and I feel in his writing, I feel that joy. I feel even as he is chastising people, he has hope for them, and that balance is also joy. But yeah, I mean, I do love the way, you know, when you read the stories, he's drinking whiskey, he's drinking wine, he's dancing, and it shows that you can't carry. Yes, you might write about the world's troubles, but you can't carry them with you as you dance, or as you sleep, or as you sit with your friends to commune. And I think it's important for all of us as artists to remember that, for all people in the world to remember that, you know, you can only do as much as you can do. And the rest of it, you have to save for joy. I say to people very often, I'm radically committed to joy, you know, so I'm cooking with my music loud. When my mom comes to stay, she's like, you take a speaker to the bathroom? I'm like, yes, I do. So, yeah.
I agree with you. I am also radically committed to joy. And I just wrote down what you said. You can only do what you can do, and the rest you have to save for joy. Beautiful.
No, I'm just saying thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. I know we're going to Q&A, but I just wanted to to acknowledge that your questions have been really thought-provoking and beautiful. And Moses, like, really great to hear your thoughts. Got me thinking about some things.
No, you as well, my bro.
Even in how I address, you know, some of the people I'm working with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, you as well.
Thank you to both of you as well. It's wonderful, wonderful to speak to you. And I'm excited to learn more about you and your work because of this introduction.
So Amelia's asking, thanks for this discussion. I would be interested to know from each of you if you can remember how you first came to encounter Baldwin's work. Which text did you read first, and how did it impact you?
Yeah, my mum had more notes of a native son. I have a much closer relationship with his non-fiction than with his fiction. So the first thing I read was More Notes of a Native Son. I actually read that before, Notes of a Native Son. And I just remember I read quite a lot, and there's a few times when I'm reading when I just have to put a book down and think this person is very intelligent, and I just like I'm a bit. It kind of excites me and it makes me want to write. This is why I'm not really good at reading contemporary works, because I'll start to read it, and then if I enjoy it, I'll immediately put it down and then go and work on my own thing. So I just never finished contemporary work. But yeah, so with Baldwin, it was More Notes of a Native Son, and I remember just thinking there can't be anyone more articulate than this. And it was when he dissed V.S. Naipaul and praised George Lamin, who I have a lot of respect for, that I thought, okay, yeah, we kind of see the world in the same light, and it made me laugh as well. It made me think of just like Nas dissing Jay-Z. So yeah, that was mine.
So for me, it was The Fire Next Time, which was mind-blowing. But I mean, so the thing I used to do when I was growing up in Ghana, we just read whatever books were available. When I came to England and I realized I could get books from the library, if I read somebody and I liked their work, I would just then binge on whatever was in the library. So so my next one was Giovanni's Room, which just completely blew my mind, because it was the first time I had just before getting to Baldwin, I'd read Alice Walker and Maya Angelou, and then read interviews. And so Baldwin's name had come up, which is how come I got to Fire Next Time. And when I read Giovanni's Room, I just like, I have not read a Black American author writing entirely white characters in Europe, which was kind of really mind-blowing for me. But also, at that time, writing about queer lives was kind of, I mean, his publisher literally said he should burn that book, and eventually was published by somebody else. Again, it goes back to what Moses was saying about being courageous, and doing what you need to do. Yeah, so I think I would say those two books together were very impactful. One for his intellect, and then two for his empathy. Because I do find lots of really intelligent people, as writers and academics when you encounter them. But I often meet very intelligent people who don't have empathy. And I think that's the thing that's striking about Baldwin, is this incredible intelligence, but never looking down on people. Which I think is a really beautiful balance. You see it in the essays, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's his emotional intelligence. I think is something that is shared by all great writers. I remember reading, because when I first read him, I was reading him, and like my mind was quite in my militant thinking. Do you know what I'm saying? And then I've read he was talking about the compassion that he feels. Well, he said compassion. I think the word he might have used is almost like pity that he feels towards white people sometimes before he catches himself, because they don't have to reconcile themselves with man, but they have to reconcile themselves with God. And that's something that's never left me and changed my perception, because as someone who believes in God and has a relationship with God, that touched me. And I think it did hold a mirror up, which are a lot of great works, especially by emotionally intelligent people, does. And so
for me, it was actually my first contact with James Baldwin, I was about 5. I come from a family of big readers. Both of my grandparents were professors at historically Black universities. So I come from a family of academics. The bookshelf was the playground in our home. And so I would see these books on the shelves. And when my mother and I moved to Washington, D.C., when I was 5, she was looking for a new church. I'm going to circle back to Nii and take it back to the church. So she was looking for a new church, and there was this church, and Baldwin was coming to speak. And she was so excited. So we were going to go to church that day. She got me all dressed up. And when we went to go sit in the pew, they told her that I had to go in the basement. And so she was like, "What are you talking about? I brought my child here because we are coming to hear James Baldwin speak." And they said, "No, that's not how our church operates. The children stay in the basement. You can come sit in the pew, but the children stay in the basement." And my mother said, "Well, I know this is not going to be our church, because I'm not going to any church where my child cannot sit in the pew and hear the sermon." And so, she made this big production of leaving. That made an impression on me to be curious about Baldwin. Who is this man that is so important that my mother walked out in the middle of a service? And then that just kind of stuck in my mind. And then when I was a teenager and I was attending this predominantly white private school, the first Baldwin book I read was Go Tell Down the Mountain, but I was taught it by a white teacher who was not up to the task, pretty much. I felt, right? And what I really loved is that it was very rare that we would get Black books on the syllabus. And anytime there was one, it was always on the shelf in my house. So it would kind of direct me to what to go look for. We had everybody: Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, Toni Morrison. And so that led me to the Baldwin. So I read Go Tell It on the Mountain in school. And then I said, okay, this is brilliant work, but I need to read this on my own. And literally the next book on the shelf was The Fire Next Time. And because I also was grappling with being a young adolescent girl in a predominantly white environment, just like Moses said, I was in my activist phase, and it just met me. That one summer I read The Fire Next Time and the autobiography of Malcolm X. So that was a really foundational part, right, of me founding my identity, forging my identity, as it were, as a Black intellectual and activist.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. We've got another question from Annabelle, who asks, how do you think Baldwin's identity as a queer Black man affected his friendships, especially with writers of an older generation?
In terms of the work as an activist, I think he was often kept out of discussions, talks, speeches, movements because of his sexuality. I remember reading Message to the Grassroots by the speech given by Malcolm X, and he was saying that, and it's kind of like you were saying, he can't, it seems as if he can't help but be honest. And Malcolm X was saying he was barred from coming to the March on Washington because they didn't know what he was going to say. So I think people, and this is, I'm not really concerned with how white people received him, but in terms of how we did, I think we probably missed out on, or even the fact that he had to go to France as well is testament to how he was received, I would say, by the black community. And I imagine we probably missed out on thoughts or collaborations or something because of the discrimination that he received.
I would agree, but I'd also say the loss also was a gain because his being in Europe also affected his perspective going forward.
For sure.
But yeah, I come back to, and we see this in the industry now. I come back to how his publisher didn't want to publish Giovanni's Room, right? Because they felt, and they're already judging who's going to read him, right? That Black people won't want to read about queer relationships, but they also probably reflecting what older generations of writers would do. Who would they get to endorse the book? That kind of thing. They were thinking about the market. So I think that reflects something. Even though there were queer writers who were older, but everybody was kind of closeted. So
right.
It was certainly interesting because I feel like even the queer writers would have felt threatened because they would have felt that he would see them or expose them. And so it makes it really, I'm sure it was very lonely on one level because you don't even get solidarity from people who are grappling with the same things that you're grappling with because of the kind of societal pressures. It's
somewhat tragic that we benefit from the trail being blazed after the fact, right? So I think the way that we are able to grapple with, to study, to examine Baldwin as a gay writer now is different, obviously, than when he was living. And it's a shame that we were not able to experience him in his fullness at the time. It's like art that always appreciates after the person is gone. Right. So I think that part of him is something, as you said, Nii, I think also could have been explored even more in his work, although it was. That conversation could have been advanced even more, particularly with him being a leader because he was out. I think there's a bit of a tragedy there that we are lucky that we are able to discuss it openly now, but it's a shame that was something that probably, again, also was kept maybe even more to conversations that were happening behind closed doors with friends in other communities, right? So probably in those rooms were the conversations that we really want to hear about this topic.
Thank you, everyone. I think we're nearing the end of our time here, so I would just like to say thank you to my wonderful panel. Thank you so much, Moses, Nii, Lisa, for chairing and bringing such wonderful questions. It has been really, really thought-provoking and lots of note-taking as well, especially about your line, Nii, about being radically committed to joy. I can only do what I can do and the rest I give to joy. I think that's something that I'm struggling to do, but I will try harder. I want to thank Nikki and Sherry, who have been our incredible interpreters for the evening. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you, everyone in the audience, for coming. and contributing to this rich discussion. The audience, I want to say that your feedback is of great importance to us as we shape next year's festival. You can find out more about the festival at wordsofcolour.co.uk/conversations with Baldwin. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Goodbye.